All right, so our next speaker also, knows what the effects of war and means for refugees. We're seeing right now in the media the horrific images coming out of Ukraine, the devastation and destruction that war can have on ordinary people's lives. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Anastasia Radievska, who is a member of the Ukrainian community, an anti-war activist, and also an organizer against the anti-protest laws shamefully passed in New South Wales Parliament recently.
Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded sovereign lands of the Gadigal people, who are the first to suffer and resist the consequences of the violent power of the Australian state that continues to be felt by First Nations people, refugees, and so many others on this continent. And I also want to acknowledge the speakers that came before me and shared their stories. Because the things that we are talking about here today are too big sometimes to fit into ordinary language, I want to begin with a poem. This poem is by Paul Celan, who was born into a Jewish family in Chernivtsi, which is now on the territory of Ukraine. Celan's mother and father were murdered in the Holocaust, and Celan himself barely survived a labor camp before being forced to flee to France to escape the Soviet regime. The poem is called All Souls. What did I do? Seminated the night as though there could be others more nocturnal than this one. Bird flight, stone flight, 1,000 described routes, glances purloined and plucked, the sea tasted, drunk away, dreamed away, an hour soul eclipsed, others, many with no place but their own heavy centers, glimpsed and avoided. Foundlings, stars, black, full of language, named after an oath which silence annulled. And once, when that too is forgotten, felt the barb where my pulse dared the counterbeat. I turn to this poem when I try to comprehend the impossible. How can it be that the streets I grew up in Kiev are being shelled? How can it be that children and their parents attempting to flee are deliberately bombed at a railway station with a missile on whose casing Russian soldiers have written, "For our children," as if murder is a balance sheet to be equalized? How can it be that similar suffering in Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, Burma is ignored, or indeed created by the same governments that condemn what is happening in Ukraine? And how can it be that the Australian government extends the suffering of people fleeing these wars through imprisonment, poverty, and exploitation? When I consider these impossible questions, I turn in part to Christianity as a faith in which I was raised. Although I'm not a practicing Christian, the story of Palm Sunday and of Jesus' crucifixion is one I come back to, because it asks questions we are all trying to grapple with. What is to be done with the suffering we witness in the world? What can we do when we are confronted by state violence? I think of the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey and almost immediately staging a protest against the economic exploitation perpetrated by religious authorities in the temple. I think of what it takes to actively confront an exploitative system. I think of the immense power of the Roman Empire and its doctrine of bureaucratic violence and violent bureaucracy. I think of the Australian state, which with bureaucratic banality indefinitely imprisons refugees or sends them back to their homelands to die. I think of the paltry support this state offers to people traumatized by war and violence, even when they are released from this detention. I think of the cruelty of temporary protection visas and the barrier they pose to bringing family to safety, the poverty they condemn refugees to by excluding them from welfare and healthcare. I think of how the government attempts to sell itself as a helper to refugees from Ukraine or Afghanistan while placing them in a cruel administrative gridlock. I think of the immense military power of the Roman state at whose hands Jesus was crucified. I think of Australia selling huge quantities of arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who use them to murder civilians in Yemen. I think of Australia refusing to halt these arms exports, even when the US, Germany, and Italy have done so. The combat aircraft used by the Myanmar military junta being funded by investment from Australia's sovereign wealth fund. The billions of dollars being invested in destructive nuclear submarines. And on a different but important part of the spectrum, the new laws here in New South Wales threatening 2 years jail for disruptive protests that interrupt the flow of business, like a certain figure nominally revered by a premier did with his protest in the temple. I think of the system of debt, slavery, and exploitation that powered the Roman Empire. I think of the companies profiteering off detention centres and the government that pays them. I think of Australia's arms exports and our contribution to life-wrecking climate change that is already forcing people to flee their homes. The silence from Western governments on the growing tide of fascism in Russia and the toleration of its crimes in Chechnya, Syria, Georgia. Silence brought by the economic benefits governments around the world obtained from trade with Russia's oligarchs. The ongoing silence about Palestine, Yemen, Kurdistan, bought by the same system of privileging the accumulation of resources over human life. And in all this, I do think of Jesus on the cross, asking, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think how many times I've asked that when faced with the immense weight of all this suffering and the powerlessness it is so common to feel when faced by it. Here I turn to theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who was conscripted into the German army at the age of 16, and in the midst of the Allied bombing of Hamburg asked, where is God in all of this? Where is God in this suffering? After being released from a POW camp, he spent his life trying to understand the suffering he was part of perpetrating and paradoxically also a victim of. I think here of the violence of conscription in Russia, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. In his book, The Crucified God, Moltmann looks to the crucifixion as a moment of joy and suffering that gives us a grounding for action despite all hope, despite our despair. In what he calls effective hope, we do not flee from the unbearable pressure of the present into a consoling better future, but draw the other human future into our present and live already by it. In other words, our hope when it comes to suffering is not that we will be able to escape it by means of consoling lies about the true nature of our government, our true treatment of refugees, or our true role in systems that perpetuate war and exploitation. Our hope is also not that we will be able to end suffering forever. Indeed, we may only be able to reduce it by what can feel like a defeatingly small amount. Our hope, or mine at least, is that when we feel confronted by the suffering of victims of state violence, this felt pain becomes a ground of truth and clarity about the system that causes it and the alternative futures that we can bring into the present through collective action. I don't pretend to know what that looks like for each of us standing here today. For many, it might look like the fight for refugee rights on this continent. For some of us, it might look like confronting the warmongering and climate change that create refugees. For me, at the moment, it looks like doing what I can to push back against expanded state violence in the form of anti-protest laws and standing in solidarity with those who fight for First Nations justice, climate justice, and refugee justice. And I'm grateful to each of you for doing what you can in the struggles you're a part of. And I think, finally again, of Jesus on the donkey, Jesus in the temple. I think about what it means to confront state violence and the impossible questions of how murder and suffering can be made right. I think of the missile casing with 4 our children written on it. And I think in the midst of the drums of state violence, militarism, interpersonal violence, dehumanization, everyday cruelty, God, give us hope to dare the counterbeat. Thank you.